What matters to us? What do we care about? And what's in a word? Is it important how we translate words from Sanskrit? Does it matter? The answer is almost always yes and no. But I think there's one particular instance where maybe it's more important than that. So, the Sanskrit term karunā is generally translated as compassion. What I really want to suggest this evening is perhaps it would be more helpful to translate karunā as simply care. And of course, the key figure of karunā in Buddhism generally and in Zen is the Bodhisattva Avalokiteśvara. And in our Zen tradition, through the Japanese, we know her as Kannon Bosatsu. So is he or she the Bodhisattva of great compassion or great caring? And is the difference important? Does the difference matter? The basic root of compassion is feeling with compassion. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But let's actually think a little bit about care. We can care for. We can care about. We can care with. We can receive care. And the reason why we care might be familiarity. Might be members of our family we care about. What matters most to you in the world? Well, probably most of us are going to talk in terms of, well, actually, it's my family. It might be desire. Romantic, sexual, otherwise. It might be that we find the position of the other strikes a chord with us, arouses our empathy, our feeling with in a stronger sense. It might be our sense of justice that motivates us to care. Or it might simply be that caring is how we earn a living. And none of those are necessarily better or worse than any of the others. They're all forms of caring because in our world, caring is what we do. And being cared for is what we do too. We give care, we receive care. All day, every day. Some of it we do without thinking. A lot of what we receive we're completely unaware of. Caring, that's just our day to day. And we can talk about, at the collective level, about the care crisis or the impossibility of finding adequate childcare provision or so many different things, all of which, absolutely impact our lives, the lives of our parents, the lives of our children. All the time we're going on caring, looking after, being looked after. So, let's get back to compassion, because compassion isn't really that, is it? Compassion is something separate, it's a bit special. It's a proper virtue. In my years as a Buddhist prison chaplain, I found a fairly consistent attitude towards compassion from the prisoners I was working with. They basically thought it stank. And I'd spend ages explaining to them, no, that's not what we mean by compassion at all. And after years of doing this, I came round to the view that actually, guys, you're right. Because compassion it's an emotion. It's a feeling. It's an emotional feeling we feel, well, we're not involved. We're not engaged. Feeling compassion might lead us to do something, but there's no necessary connection. And because we're not involved, because we're not engaged, there's a sense of separation. There's a sense of superiority, almost condescension about it. I deign to have compassion for you. And my guys in prison were really acutely aware of this kind of resonance. Yeah, so we can say, well, if we think of figures of great compassion within our own tradition, and I'm not casting aspersions or being derogatory in any way, it would be a philosopher, a saint, meditating in their cell or working hard, feeling deep thoughts of fellow feeling with the world and compassion, while presumably their cleaner cleaned around them, their cook, presumably both female, brought them their dinner. The everyday work of actual caring, action in the world. And it's important to compassion that it's understood as, in that sense, disinterested, objective, standing back, because it comes directly out of the Christian tradition. It's a Latin word, and Latin in our culture is the language of hierarchy, it's the language of power, it's the language of the church. And within the Christian tradition, there's this big debate early on within the church about what love is for Christianity. Agape, whether it's disinterested, disembodied, purely spiritual, or whether it has a much more immediate, physical, engaged quality about it. And it was decided absolutely that it should be thought of as standing back. Compassion in its relationship to love, they're both passions, they're both things we feel, they're both things we don't necessarily choose to feel, but they're not directly about action, about engagement in the world. There's this lovely story that the Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa used to tell about. He'd do work with compassion with his students, and they'd get into wonderful states and I just feel so much compassion for every living being. And Trungpa would say, no, you don't. You're just being sentimental. That's not compassion. What is compassion in this sense? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh always argued that compassion, because he was using compassion, isn't about feeling. It's knowing how to care, how to help, what to do in a situation of suffering. Might be our own suffering, might be the suffering of other people. It's about action, it's about practicality. So we can be as wonderful as we like, we can be as virtuous as we like, but actually what we need is practical action. Even if that practical action is simply being with, doing nothing very impressive or concrete. Compassion marks us out and makes us special, separate. Caring is just what we do. We don't always do it well. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we do it extraordinarily badly, but it's what we do. Within the Buddhist tradition and they figure within Zen are the figures of the Bodhisattvas, the beings who work tirelessly to end the suffering of all, who don't just sit on clouds. If necessary, they go down to the hell realms to save all beings. And when we chant the four great vows, we chant to save all beings. We vow to save all beings, whatever that means, whether we're thinking in terms of suffering or something else. They take action. The Bodhisattvas care. And okay, there's so much hedging round within a Zen and Buddhist tradition that it's not simply engagement, it's not simply involvement. But equally, it would be a huge mistake to see it as completely disinterested, as standing back. Because without the reality of engagement, what are we actually doing? Let's take a concrete example. Let's go back to Kannon Avalokiteśvara, the Bodhisattva of infinite compassion, infinite care. The story is told. Kannon Avalokiteśvara cared so much about the world, so frustrated, so despairing of their ability to intervene on behalf of all sentient beings, that they literally exploded with despair, with grief, with frustration. And then, wonderfully, reformed. And in one of the better known and very beautiful images of Avalokiteśvara, Kannon comes back together with 1,000 arms, and we see these arms arrayed around them. Why 1,000 arms? Well, there's so much to do. Not there's so much to feel about. There's so much compassion to be had. There's so much to do, action in the world. And traditionally, in many of the forms, many of these arms hold symbolic attributes about practice, about healing. You'll find many teachers who will point out that, well, it's a nice story, isn't it? And this is where we come across some of the first questions about how do we think of Avalokiteśvara? How do we think about the Bodhisattvas? And if we're in the Tibetan tradition, we will think of them as real forces within the world. Other traditions, we might think of them as more symbolic. Even the great Zen teacher Hakuin in the 17th century was, absolutely insistent. Avalokiteśvara is always with us. Kannon is always with us. She will always help. She will always assist. Yeah, this is a vast subject, and I haven't got anything like time to go there this evening. So we'll roll with the story as I'm telling it. If you see Kannon as this eternal force working throughout the universe, independently of us, and I suppose that's the question, then, okay, you can say it's a nice story. Of course, no, this is just illustrating the depths of Avalokiteśvara's caring, Avalokiteśvara's compassion for the world. But I think if we don't wish to say that Avalokiteśvara is a real, in that sense, being, and we just take the story as a story at its own value and take it really quite literally at that level as a story. This engagement with the world, this caring about the world, is why, absolutely, Avalokiteśvara comes apart, and why it is necessary that she reforms with 1,000 arms to be able to offer care, to be able to intervene in the lives of sentient beings. And I think we could go further than this. It's the action of caring, the reality of caring in the world, that brings Avalokiteśvara Kannon back together. It's that activity of caring, activity of relationship, not seeing myself as separate, as isolated, as looking down on the world. And I should, of course, mention that Avalokiteśvara's name means, according to the two different origins we have for this name, the one who sees the suffering of the world, or the one who hears the cries of the world. There is need, there is suffering, there is pain. And Avalokiteśvara Kannon is about this response. It's about this active movement towards caring, connection, relationship, involvement. So if we see, as I obsessively return to, the key characteristic of our existence as being not separate, not one, not simply merged with, but not separate. How is Avalokiteśvara Kannon, how is care to manifest in this world? Well, obviously, through us, through these. I have two hands. Within the world, at my last check, we have about 16.4 billion hands. Are they capable of working together to hear the cries of the world, to see the suffering of the world, to address this need for care? How do we do that? How should we go about that? I feel this is one of the weaker spots in the way that Zen is traditionally talked about, because it's not about making judgments. We're not all the time going around saying who's right, who's wrong, because it's not about even necessarily discursive thinking in that sense. There's this tendency to say, oh, it's just spontaneity. Once you've got it, you just understand, you just see. And so of course you act appropriately, of course you care appropriately. But I'd like to suggest it's rather more complicated than that. Certainly we're not in business of separating things out, but do I innately know how to do things? I am innately aware of how to relate to all situations, just because I've been practicing for a while, just because maybe I am genuinely beginning to experience the world as a little less divided up into you and me and everybody else, all in our separate little silo. Is that enough? Caring's practical. We need to understand how to do it, and because caring is infinitely varied, infinitely diverse, collectively between the 16.4 billion arms that we do have, we need to master all these different challenges, all these different possibilities. might actually be talking about ethics. And ethics traditionally we talk about in terms of the precepts, but immediately we say ethics, we're thinking right and wrong, tell me what to do, tell me don't want to do. That doesn't really seem to feel right, doesn't really seem to square with this notion of just offering care, receiving care. How can we begin to square that circle? You see, this is why I think care is so much more appropriate as a line than compassion, because let's go back to the saints and philosophers. You know, somebody had to know the practicalities of how to cook their dinner, get all the stuff together, arrange for it, come and collect the dishes. Absolutely mundane, practical stuff. The kind of stuff we don't value. That's the kind of work performed traditionally by women, who traditionally we don't value as much as we value men. And Kannon Avalokiteśvara is fascinating and actually completely unique in the Buddhist tradition. Avalokiteśvara, coming out of the Indian tradition, is always represented as male, seen as male. Interestingly, in the Tibetan tradition, we have this parallel form of Avalokiteśvara Tara, but who's female, but we won't go there. Within both the Chinese and the Japanese tradition, as Guanyin, Kannon, Kanzeon, are represented traditionally as female, sometimes even with little baby, maternal care. And obviously there's a kind of little echo there with the Christian figure of the Virgin Mary who intercedes on our behalf. Again, that's another story for another day. But this femaleness is interesting. And in terms of developing a different ethics, this is where it gets really interesting, because in 1982, a female psychology researcher, Carol Gilligan, published a little book called In a Different Voice, which was a record of her attempts to understand the significance of why, according to traditional methods of assessment, girls were just less moral than boys. They didn't have the same rational awareness. They just didn't develop at the same rate or to the same degree. When she reviewed, investigated this literature further, what did Gilligan find? That actually the girls were just thinking in a different way, speaking in a different voice. And this voice was one of relationship, not judgments of right and wrong. What might I do? What am I not allowed to do? But, hey, there's a problem here. There's a need. How do we resolve this? What can we do practically to sort this out? How does everybody feel? Not, well, sorry, it's legal or not, but how do we bring people's experience, their engagement, their practicality to this? So in that last 40 years, care ethics has grown terrifically. Interestingly, again, so many of the important contributions have been made by women. Philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, people from the professional care traditions. And it's evolved into a different way of thinking about ethics that's not so much about law and justice, about tell me what I'm allowed to do and tell me what I'm not allowed to do, but about how we organise care as you and me, as individuals in our world, but also how we might go on to do that in the society we have, and even what effect that might have on the direction we'd like our society to go. So from Kannon Avalokiteśvara to the ethics of care, think there's a really strong connection. And over probably the rest of the talks I ever do, we'll begin to explore this a little more. But I think next week I will try and talk a little bit more about how care ethics might help us reframe the way we think about the role of ethics in our everyday practical lives. Yeah, I think that's all I've got for today, so hopefully see you next time.